This is the Code to Cash podcast.
Pricing is not a billing problem. Pricing is a code problem. Pricing is a product.
Price point is really the last thing that actually even matters.
You need to have the most atomic unit of your product, not your product.
Hi, my name is Ajit. Welcome to the Code to Cash podcast. Today we have Fessal, have more than 2 decades of experience in tech and SaaS and a pricing monetization expert. Someone I really enjoy talking to both online as well as offline. We have a lot of great information exchange on LinkedIn, and Fessal has provided me a lot of great feedback on pricing. So I'm very happy to have this conversation with you today. Welcome.
Thank you, Ajit. Thank you for having me. Looking forward to our little chat this time.
Yeah,
for everyone to hear.
Yeah, just to kick things off, you worked at commercial operations, revenue operations, pricing and monetization roles at quite a few different firms. Maybe if you want to give the listeners just a little bit of a glimpse of your background and how these roles have evolved over your career, that'd be interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, as you can imagine, I think the last 2 decades we probably embraced moving from on-premise technology to cloud. We've had obviously the innovation of subscription coming into play, and the last few years, you can imagine pricing and monetization has become really forefront of everyone's mind nowadays because there's so much variability, right? You've got your classic sort of licensing fee, the flat-based, usage-based. When you start thinking about all of these different strategies that we've adopted in the past, you always have this end-to-end thing as well, right? Around how do you now go and enable this, right? Operationalize it. It's not just about the strategy and the execution. So I've been very fortunate to have worked for some really large companies, some enterprise companies like Lenovo and Teradata. Recently, moved more into the sort of startup ecosystem with some incredible organizations, Emarsys and Cloudinary, for example. And, they have owned, the revenue sort of strategy and the principles behind it. And as you can imagine, value creation and pricing pretty much go hand in hand. And, you think about all the best pricing strategies that, we can all come up with, which align value. How do you then go and implement that? How do you go and operationalize it in your systems? Because the last thing you want is an inaccurate bill to your customer, right? So that experience has to follow all the way through. So yeah, we'll be talking a little bit about, the experiences across the end-to-end state. You sort of call it code to cash, if you like. It's exactly that, right? You need to build, you need to think about the strategy. How will you build it and make sure that the customer experience at the end of it is exactly how you want it in your strategy. So yeah, looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome, cool. So, your experiences sort of mimic what has been happening in the industry, and you've been working at increasingly more startups in your career journey. So I'm curious, what has been, the biggest change, just before we even come to the topic of systems, in terms of how companies think about pricing and monetization? Is there something noticeable that you pick up over the last 10, 20 years?
Yeah, so, the way I would always think about it from my perspective, I do a lot of work with Bain, by the way, as well, Bain & Company. And so we have a lot of their portfolio companies that we advise. So when you think about building a high growth company, right, I always think it's a little bit like crafting a masterpiece, right? You've got the product, which is your canvas. You've got your strategy, which is your brushstroke. And then you've got the pricing, which is effectively the frame, right? It's how you showcase that value. And you think about the journey that we take all the way from start to sort of now, and fundamental shift that we've had in the industry, I think, and it's specifically around the product strategy, right? I think monetization is now coming much closer to the actual product strategy. Before it used to be very much an afterthought. Here's the product, we've done a great go-to-market, we've done our ICPs, we know who we're selling to and how we sell. Oh, how do we now convey the value, right? Yeah. And it's very much the product is already in its instance. We know all the various parameters that we're going to go and measure, if you like, from a product usage perspective or a product interacting perspective. And now we're thinking about pricing, and we sort of already half baked the cake, right? And now we're sort of thinking, we need to monetize this thing. How do we now bring it back? And all of a sudden we start having complexities around what if we want to monetize it and align value in a different way to which the product is built and how the product is now engaging with its customers, right? And I think that's what I've definitely seen over the past decade for sure. I think monetization is becoming much more one of those key levers, I think, when you think about product strategy.
Makes sense. And that's definitely been happening a lot in SaaS, and we've seen with the growth of PLG and as well as infrastructure as a SaaS, more of a requirement to do this. I'm curious because you've worked not just in core tech and SaaS, you've worked in other industries as well, and you're advising for Bain. What are you seeing in the other industries outside of tech and SaaS? Because sometimes we can be a little bit of an insular bubble.
Yeah, I think you think about if you park pricing and you park SaaS, what I would say is from a consumer perspective, right? Your end product
Mm,
is pretty much serving a consumer, and what we're really seeing is the consumer landscape now changing, right? You
mm,
think about we talk about subscription from a SaaS perspective, but you take something like a content, you take Netflix as a provider, right? I think Netflix
mm,
has completely transformed the media content delivery model, right? In terms of
yeah,
you pay a subscription, there may be
yeah,
a couple of packaging tiers, and then you consume as much as you want, and you start thinking about Amazon in terms of the way Amazon sells products, in terms of AWS, right? Amazon Web Services, how it sells based on a usage base. I think now
mm,
we're really programmed as a consumer and as a business user to be really intertwined. I don't really see a
yeah,
big difference between a business purchase and a consumer purchase now. I think the thinking and the
right,
thought process behind it is very
right,
much similar, and I think that's what's transforming so many
right.
different industries. Recently I spent a little bit of time in telco as an example. One of those industries which I think most people will say is probably a little bit behind the curve in terms of being
Mm-hmm,
that consumer and digital first sort of methodology.
mm-hmm,
They're thinking about it now. They're thinking about how do we now actually not just have this flat usage based pricing or this flat model? How do we
yeah,
now make sure that we can align our value proposition, as it were, with
mm-hmm,
in line with our consumers, and particularly in line with consumer perception and behavioral, right? Their preferences have changed. Now, all of a sudden,
mm-hmm,
Netflix has changed the way they consume their content. How do we now add those value drivers in as well? And I've spent a little bit of time in automotive as well, and I think you
mm-hmm,
probably are pretty familiar with this. The automotive industry, how they're now starting to think about, the car as a service, right? The
yeah,
subscription model behind it, rather than your classic, let's go and sell you a car.
yeah.
Is now it's in terms of what do you want to do with the car? Do you need the car all the time? And I think we're coming to see I
Mm,
think a landslide, a bit of innovation coming in with autonomous vehicles and stuff, and how subscription I think will bring that to the surface as well. So I think
makes
even
sense.
some of those industries a little bit
Mm,
behind the curve. I think they're going to
mm,
catch up really quick.
mm, mm. And I noticed on your LinkedIn, you've started to write more on the topic of RevOps nowadays. I'm curious what brought that about, and why you feel more passionate. So we talked about pricing monetization as a strategy, but curious about the systems angles as well.
Yeah, I think RevOps. When you think about RevOps, you're really trying to understand how do you align customer funnel, right?
Mm-hmm.
Customer journey
Mm,
with your product strategy, right? With your business strategy. And pricing is obviously a really, really key element of that, but it's not the only element. So for me, it's very much how do you start thinking holistically with all the various different levers that you need to understand? Your go-to-market efficacy, for example, your sales journey, your pricing and packaging. How do you convey the right value? And as you know, with SaaS, the compound effect happens with your customers that you already have. How do you expand on them? How do you make sure they don't churn, etc.? And I think
mm,
those sort of levers under the umbrella, I think, of a revenue operations, I think it gives you a little bit more
mm,
perspective about how do
mm,
you stitch it all together. And we
mm-hmm,
will talk a little bit about the systems behind the scenes, and I think that's where revenue operations, I think, can really play a part, because I think
mm,
it's very native around marketing operation systems, sales
mm,
operation systems. But what about pricing systems? What about billing systems? Now, all of a sudden,
mm,
how do we really say, when we talk about revenue operations, is it really end to end today? I would
mm,
say it probably stops at the customer billing aspect.
mm-hmm.
How can we include that, have that journey all the way through to the end, and have that really sort of very very synthesized, if you like, approach to the customer journey all the way through from selecting a product, growing a product, paying for a product as well.
So definitely looking forward to discussing a little bit more on the system side. I think one question I often have, specifically thinking about the sort of roles you've had, which have been both strategic and operational, is the more of an executive importance paid to monetization. Now, sometimes, and maybe this has been different in your experience, but I've seen a diffuse sort of responsibility when it comes to monetization. All CEOs say, yes, this is very important. This is so critically important. But for some reason, things don't change in an organization. You have, for a while, you have the same model and then something breaks, and then the McKinseys or Simon Kutchers of the world come in and there's a huge project. And again, it seems like there is a little bit of a hurdle in change happening. So Curious to see, do you see it the same way? Have you experienced this? And what brings about some of the bottlenecks?
Yeah, I think you're 100% accurate, by the way, on that statement. I've had the luxury of working with a lot of customers through Bain, for example, and you start thinking about, yes, we can do a lot of optimization in terms of the business model, right, in terms of the strategy, but there's a lot of value creation levers, right? And you will know
Mm-hmm.
really well that one of the
Mm-hmm.
biggest value relation levers is pricing. If
Mm-hmm.
you can incrementally add some pricing or align yourself pricing so your customers grow faster with you, the impact is straight to the bottom line, right? And I think
Yeah.
a lot of the hesitation comes with the fact pricing is one of those really emotional topics as well for a
Hmm.
lot of people.
Interesting.
It doesn't really, I don't really feel it has a very natural place in an organization either, in the sense, we've
Yeah.
had, I've worked for organizations, sitting under marketing, sitting under the CRO, you're sitting under the COO, for example. And all of those, if you think about their sort of vantage point, it's very different, right?
Mm-hmm.
Marketing is very different in terms of it's more about brand awareness, hitting your ICP, etc. You've got the CRO, who's very much around sales and sales efficacy and sales performance. Operational is, does it all work, flawlessly? Do we end up giving a bill to a customer which represents their, what they've subscribed to or what they've used? And I always find with the CEO, when you talk to the CEOs about the opportunity ahead, where you can start restating some of the fundamentals and the financials and the impact, everybody gets excited about more revenue and more EBIT, right? It's an obvious thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the trepidation typically comes to, we have hundreds or thousands of customers. How do we now start thinking about saying to these guys, we're going to change this model that we've been working with you for several years, right? The product evolution has probably been incredible. And the pricing evolution, I've been in organizations where the pricing, for example, when's the last time you did pricing? And it's like 17 years ago. It's like, wow. And think about that, right?
Yeah.
17 years ago, the landscape,
Yeah.
in terms of your competitors, what your customers are looking for, the pricing models that we've got access to today, the incredible technology that we've got access to today, where we can actually really start A/B testing and really start understanding, and we align that value. It's in a
Mm-hmm.
completely different, atmosphere now, right? But that's the reality, right? And you think
Yeah.
about a lot of the pricing models, even where companies are tweaking it.
Yeah.
You think about a lot of the stats that you get from the likes of OpenView, Bessemer, for example, and specifically in
Yeah.
SaaS. Over 50% of companies are still adopting something akin to user-based pricing,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I would always call user-based pricing. It does work in certain scenarios, but it's the laziest version
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
pricing from my
Yes.
perspective, right?
Yeah.
And then you go in and then explain why that is, right?
Yeah.
You think about Salesforce. You've got 10 Salesforce licenses to 10 people, but what
Yeah.
if one of them is delivering $100 million of
Mm.
incremental revenue through his action, right? And the others
Yeah.
are delivering $1 million. You're still
Yeah.
charging the same person every single dollar,
Yeah.
right? It's $100 per user. For me, how do you align it to the value that you're actually delivering and link it to that
Mm-hmm.
business outcome? And for me,
Mm-hmm.
it really impacts also the sales cycle. When you
Mm-hmm.
start thinking about sales stages and you're starting
Mm-hmm.
to think about value exchange, value communication, having the right pricing model really, really works. And so I find it quite fascinating that when you think about the trepidation that exists today, they think about it purely from a change perspective. And I think change, as you can imagine, makes people nervous. There is a little bit of fear. But
Yeah.
again, this is where I think the framework comes into account, right? Like, you bring the right expertise into the organization or from external. You mentioned Simon Kucher, for example. How do you bring that expertise in where it's not about this big bang change? Just like a
Mm.
product, you wouldn't
Yeah.
say to you wouldn't turn a product off and replace it with a new product
Yeah.
in the same cycle, right? You do it over time. I find
Yeah.
pricing, very much like a product.
Yeah.
Iterate it over time, implement it over time, but the end goal should be very much, built around, does it add more value to your customers? Does it
Mm-hmm.
enable them to grow and align with the value that they're hopefully receiving and realizing?
Yeah.
And I don't think any of the fundamentals are changed. So I always try to instill that methodology and mentality. Think of it like a product, guys. Your
Yeah.
product will never stand still, and if your product stands still,
Yeah.
you'll probably be out of business,
Makes sense.
in the short term.
Makes sense completely. So on one hand, I mean, there are still folks who, there are the 17 years I won't change pricing and I see it as different, right? And there are probably companies who think, oh, pricing is just the product, right? It's not different from my product, and I have to evolve it and iterate it and test it. Are there organizations that you've seen have that mentality towards pricing? Like, hey, I'm just going to keep changing it, keep iterating, A/B test, just the same way I do my product? Like, are there organizations you think are sort of more best in class when it comes to the way they think about monetization?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's some incredible organizations out there, and you hear about them. You hear about them in terms of blogs that they write about. They're making these pricing changes, and they're kind of justifying the value exchange that they're trying to align to better more capabilities come out. We talk about product a lot. We talk about product innovation, right? You're constantly spending a large proportion of your revenue on developing your product and hopefully delivering more and more value because your roadmap is very closely tied with your customers. Why shouldn't you be charging something which is relevant to that, right? So I had a scenario for one of the organizations that I worked for, actually in a MarTech organization, where the customer was consuming the product 25-30% year on year. That was the growth. Incredible, right? They're using more and more of the product. There's a very much good conveying of the value going on. We can show them the value that we're delivering. And yet the revenue from those customers in terms of expansion revenue was growing 2 or 3%. So clearly you can see there's a disconnect, right? Yes, the value is there. Yes, the product is getting adopted and used more. But the benefit to us, it's not very equitable, right? Your customers are getting great benefit and we're getting a very small part of that. Surely there's something that we need to look at. And does that mean we charge customers more? Of course, there's always a rationale behind that. Or do we align the pricing to our customers a little bit more, right? And one of the things that we should really focus on things like the value metric, right? When you think about usage-based pricing, don't be afraid to challenge your value metric. And value metrics will change over time, right? Because we suffer a lot of the time. When you think about infrastructure, you think about content delivery networks is a really good example. They charge based on bandwidth delivered. It starts becoming commoditized really, really quickly, right? And then all of a sudden, yes, you're growing your revenues, but then there's a lot of pricing pressure on that, that rate, if you like. Is there another rate card that you need to apply? Is there some sort of hybrid model that you need to think about? So for me, we know these customers, especially the ones that have been, not changing their pricing for several years, it's not just about the change. It's also thinking about it. What if you didn't change? What the impact could be? I.e., then you start thinking about your same customers using your same technology, growing, but your revenues might be going completely the inverse way, right? And then your SaaS metrics all of a sudden are really looking, you're really looking bad in the sense your customers are growing, but your revenue is reducing. Now, how is that possible? Right? You've got a disconnect. So for me, it's very much, it starts with your product, your strategy, be really laser focused on obviously the metrics that you're delivering and see how you can, balance them.
Makes sense. I think so. In this context, many times, even as a practitioner of pricing, strategy and systems, one of the things I have often struggled with in my career, in multiple roles where pricing was a core part of my job, was to change a new change. I could even align on strategy with executives much faster. Executives says, yes, this makes sense. We want to be more agile to what the customer wants. We're going to have this hybrid model in one case. In another case, we wanted to change something. But systems took a long time and it took a massive hurdle. So I'm curious, what have you experienced? One is the strategy. What is the state of systems to do this today? And how have you found success to align systems to the strategy?
Yeah, I think this one is such a compelling question in the sense that, for me, it comes that matter of, the wasted time is what it really comes down to. And, I've had exactly the same scenarios that you referred to, right? Where we've gone to all our stakeholders, C-suite stakeholders. We've formed a really good analysis in terms of, why we need to change and the impact of the change. And you get really good buy-in, right? And you've got the buy-in and you're effectively saying with your pricing strategy hat on, great, all systems go. Then you move over to implementation, right? The operational side of the role. And you already were starting to realize we don't have systems designed to be able to manage this change. Right? We've had this system that's been built over time. And, again, you think about a 10-year-old startup, for example, where the product strategy is followed, eventually after a few years by a pricing strategy. That operational system that manages that environment in terms of counting, the metrics that you were set on based on originally and how you measure those and how you make sure your invoices are accurate. They've been updated and probably a little bit of optimization over time, but it's something that we're managing in-house. You take organizations like Cloudinary, an amazing company which builds products for the media experience. That's their DNA, right? That's their R&D department. Now, all of a sudden, I'm saying, can we take some of your folks out from your R&D department and start building me something which has got nothing to do with our sort of value proposition, nothing to do with our innovation, building something for a pricing change.
Yeah.
Obviously there's a question to be had in terms of, is that the right thing to be doing, right? Doing this in-house. But B, the real question is really, should I even be thinking about taking my, R&D teams
Yes.
out to be doing this? And it's not a once and done type approach either, as you know, right? We want to be making changes all the time if there's rationale behind it. So for me, I think a lot of the mentality has been around, it's our pricing model, it's our operational system. I don't want to move this over to a third party. I want to build, and then you sort of start building, and unfortunately, this is the timepiece. 6 months passes, 12 months passes. Your strategy from a year ago, you're starting to think about, is it even relevant now, right? Do I need to make a change on the initial model because it's now getting outdated? And in 12 months' time, you start realizing, guys, we need some third-party expertise to come in and help us, not necessarily with a view to only buy, but at least show us what's available on the market. It's never going to be plug and play, but at least from a focus perspective, we're still focusing on what makes us great, and we're using best-in-class technology, to sort of augment that strategy.
In the space of systems, I'm going to be asking not a self-serving question, but I guess more of a pertinent curiosity to me. I've seen systems, a lot of systems actually come up on the billing side. Every other day, it seems like there's another billing vendor. There's our common friend Door. He has his company on the product side to help with the provisioning, things like that. I'm curious, what would be your, as a monetization and ops practitioner, ideal evolution of this category of systems? You call them CPQ or quoting systems. I have a perspective, but I'm curious to see, like, what have been your experiences with this stack as it stands today, and where do you think it? What would you like instead of it, or where would you like it to be for the things that it does today?
Yeah, really, really, really intrigued by your response as well on this. By the way, G, I know you have a lot of experience in there, but for me, when you think about that front end, if you like, of the pricing model, right, or the back end, whichever way you want to look at it, for me, it's really about decoupling it from your product and usage environment. It has to be decoupled, right? If I want to make a change in my packaging, for example, I don't want to be working on the product usage environment or how the product is interacting. I want there to be some sort of orchestration in the middle, which is saying I'm now taking features, capabilities out of package A and moving them over to package B.
Yeah.
I shouldn't have to go into a product environment. The moment you start looking backwards in terms of the implications, I think that's where the slowdown creates, and that's where you end up with this cumbersome approach where it's actually a lot of activity now to make changes. I really want to be thinking about it from a front end perspective, and I should be feeding information, right? Your back end should be feeding it, APIs, giving all the metrics, and hundreds of metrics potentially. We should be understanding all interactions with our customers. Even if we're not using it at the moment, we should still be capturing all the metrics that we can capture. And for me, it's really about how do you build a front end, right, which allows change to happen. Now, you may not roll the change out in complete end to end, but from A/B testing, for example, how can I start doing A/B testing without interrupting the model that exists today with obviously most of our customers? So for me, it's very much this front end orchestration, monetizing tool, whatever you want to call it, where that's where the business user, if you like, the pricing user can start playing with having to always be reflecting on, now I need to go and speak to the operations team, look at the product operations team. For me, it's really about, forward looking. Let's capture what we can capture, and let's make changes smart, because, we talk about, how can we start being in this world where we're iterating the product world? How many versions of our product come out every year, right? It used to be annually. Very quickly, it moved to quarterly. Now we've got loads of companies doing weekly, right? Which is incredible, right? You have a great capability, release it. And for me, it's the same with pricing, right? If I want to make a change on pricing, I don't want to be waiting 6 months to 9 months or 3 months. I want to be making changes, at least testing changes, pretty much instantaneously. And I think you talk about the role of growth marketeer, right? Growth pricing model, right? Growth pricing, individual. It's exactly the same. How can you and you think about, you mentioned PLG at the start. PLG is a very, very fluid model, right? Where you potentially are having tens of thousands of potential customers coming to your website every week. That's your landscape. Me having to do A/B testing, I could get results within a week or two in terms of the. Why would I want to wait 6 months for that, right? So for me, that front end piece, I think is going to be, really critical. And I think today we have a couple of product categories that can do the job.
Yeah.
I wouldn't really classify as saying, there's, one product category which is perfect, and there's a couple of good players in there which can do all of that for me. We speak about, people that we know in the industry who obviously have built out products. Again, A/B testing, packaging side, yes. Now we start talking about the billing side as well. It starts adding a bit more complexity.
Makes sense. One of the things in my experience, I've worked more in sales-led companies, lesser in PLG companies, and I've always often thought about a salesperson experience as the conduit between like my pricing working or not working. There was an organization I came in where like the sales team completely revolted to a previous model and they did not even adopt it. And in other organizations, I've seen sellers really confused by a huge amount of complexity. So I'm curious, what have you seen in terms of the experience of a seller, and how does that impact your ability to monetize your products?
Yeah, I mean, super relevant, right? You think about, all the stakeholders that we in pricing tend to have to manage, right? And it's pretty much end to end. It's the whole company you're thinking about. And I had an incredible experience, during my time at Teradata, where this is a company that was moving to SaaS, subscription-based pricing, right? So it was basically the classic, perpetual licensing, right? Moving to SaaS. So big ticket item, you sell once to a customer and then you go back and see them in 5 years. If they want to grow their business again, you're not really concerned about anything in the middle. And you're telling, an organization of 50, 60 years of, a growth organization doing well, you're talking about sales individuals who've been very, very successful selling a particular way. And all of a sudden we're saying we're going to change it. We're now going to move over to a subscription. Your deal becomes a fraction of the size. You're now having to, you're having to sort of educate, if you like, what does this mean in terms of, compensation? What does this mean in terms of commissions? Now I have to go and manage a customer cycle over every year I'm engaged with a customer. I'm not leaving this customer. It's a massive education, right? And I think it comes back down to the same conversation that we had around, change management. It's a big change management. And for me, you have to be really, really critical and really, really clear with every part of your stakeholder community around what's the benefit for your company. What's the benefit based first and foremost? What's the benefit for your customer? What's the benefit for sales? And you have to break it down and you have to get that buy-in in all three because, as you said, if salespeople are not motivated to sell in your new strategy, for example, it's not necessarily a failing of the strategy. But the reality is, as everyone will say, it's all about execution, right? If you're not executing on a strategy, the best strategies, have ended up, ditched somewhere. Because you didn't put the thought process or the real decisiveness around how are you going to execute, how are you going to get those champion salespeople to start selling, start building some credibility with the sales model, sharing their success, sharing their stories, and effectively try to become a bit infectious with this. And so I've managed from the extreme cases in terms of a company really set in a particular way to companies which again are really forthcoming. If it can help me sell better, if it can help me convey value more, they're willing to try. But I think that relationship, that pricing, I've worked in sales myself, and for me, that relationship with pricing and sales, when you think about A/B testing, sales are an incredible way to go and do some of that asset testing, right? They've got brilliant relationships with customers. You can go and have those qualitative conversations with their customers, with them, or at least giving them the responsibility. So for me, it's huge to make sure that we get, especially in PLS, that we get the salespeople on board. And for me, carve it out. Be a little bit selfish in terms of this is your benefit. We think you're going to sell more. We think the market's moving in terms of buying it in bite sizes of consumption. They don't want to spend $1 million now. They want to spend $20,000 a month. But they'll spend it for 5 years, right? Over time, we'll make sure that your benefits, if you like, your comp is not impacted. In fact, it's the other way around, right? You'll get more compensation this way. And how do we show that to them? So I think it has to be, yes, you build a little bit of credibility. Yes, you build a bit of trust. But for me, you need to get the buy-in.
Makes sense. A little bit sort of in the same vein, but more about our current times. So we've been through a massive, at least, downstream of the federal banks' interest rate hikes. Tech has really suffered in the last 18 months. Margins, there's been a lot of margin pressure. In this environment, what have you seen as to what gets prioritized in a project list for a monetization of RevOps person? What are you able to focus on, and what becomes sort of this is optional, this is nice to do, but not right now?
Yeah, for me, I think, the last 12 months have been brutal, right? You think
Yeah,
about SaaS specifically.
yeah.
For me, I think when you're starting to talk about pricing, for me, you're really starting to talk about efficiency as well. Now, how can
Mm-hmm.
we be more efficient?
Yeah.
And I think it ends up coming down to an overarching strategy again, right?
Mm-hmm.
The 80-20 rule, where do you know that you've got an 80% fit and you can be in that fit better? And I think that's what you really want to focus on. And that's what I've seen companies really sort of doubling down on. The 20%, which could potentially explode, right, could exponentially grow,
Mm-hmm.
that's
Mm-hmm.
probably getting parked. Now it's really thinking, I think 80%, we know this is the market, these are the types of customers that we want to go after.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We need to double down. And I think some of the, if you like, the testing or the experimentation side, which is massively valuable, by the way, right? But they're the ones that tend to get paused a little bit. But for me, I think it's really been, it's been a real big eye opener as well. I think the efficiency side of the business, right? You talk about
Yeah.
sales efficiency, right? You talk
Yeah.
about pricing efficiency. You're setting
Yeah.
pricing. How much are you realizing? How do you double down on those, right?
Yeah.
The main attraction, for you to close a
Yes.
deal in these times is let's discount more.
Yeah.
You're
Yes.
setting the
Yeah.
wrong tone for that customer potentially over the next several
Over
years,
the whole relationship. Yeah.
over the
Yeah.
whole relationship. And it's like, how do you not do that? And then
Yeah.
the risk of that is no customer, or the
Yeah.
customer gets pushed into another cycle in the next
Yeah.
quarter or the next quarter. So it's really, really challenging. But I
Yeah.
think really focusing on where you're delivering value and
Yeah.
really value, conveying that value in a really extreme way. And
Yeah.
I think that's where we're seeing a lot of benefit as well. The companies that I've seen and I've been working with are doing incredibly well in this environment are the ones who really know where their big tickets are and where they're good at playing and how they make sure that they really convey the value to their customer. So that customer looks at, I've got 100 SaaS subscriptions with the technology vendors.
Yeah.
This one I can't change. Right?
Yes.
This
Yeah.
one we need to keep on spending. The other
Yes.
ones who have a slightly
Yes.
fragmented value story, if you like, or you haven't
Yeah.
helped them, you may have
Yeah.
communicated it, but you haven't helped the customer realize that
Yeah.
value.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're the ones that are seeing a lot of the cutting back,
Yeah.
right? Where they're saying, let's
Makes
scale
sense.
it down. Maybe I'm not going to churn, but I'm gonna go from 10 users to 8 users to 7 users. And I think it
Yeah.
comes back down to that value communication isn't enough. You need
Yeah.
to make sure you're doing value realization with your customer stakeholders, right? The people that sign the
Yeah.
checks. They
Yeah.
need to realize these products are the ones that we cannot change. This is
Yeah.
really still providing us a major value that we can actually, speak about, realize. Let's not be the bottom 20% of the SaaS technology vendors.
Yeah. Makes sense. Uh, and a related question to your role, right? I've always noticed that a RevOps role, there is a strategic element, and there's also like the day-to-day crisis element where you're trying to fight fires, and you have to deal with a lot of vendors, maybe similar to like a marketing ops role, but you
Yeah.
have so many things that you have to make sure that they work together, integrate. I'm curious what you prioritize and how, like what sort of vendors, like, okay, yes, this is something I want to invest in, and where do you feel, what are these, there's so many companies out there, what do they need to understand to really make this person in a RevOps role successful?
Yeah, so you hit the nail on the head, right? So you think about the firefighting, right? The admin side, the teams, my teams would say, the tactical parts of the role, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Spending a lot of time doing, right? We talk
yeah,
about a great strategy from an end-to-end perspective in RevOps, and then
yeah,
we end up spending 90% of our time firefighting.
yeah.
You really need to dissect the firefighting, right? And you start
Mhm,
thinking
mhm.
about what's the components of firefighting that we're doing. And it
Yeah.
typically comes down to data and workflows, right?
Mhm,
You've
mhm,
got potentially 10 or 15 different technology stacks that you're trying
mhm.
to connect. The
Yeah,
moment you make one change in one process,
yeah,
there's
yeah,
impacts.
yeah,
Eight of the 10 impacts you're probably going to be aware of. The other
yeah,
two, you kind of
yeah,
fly over, right? And then that
yes,
comes and bites you later on. And
yeah,
that's where your firefighting starts. So I think
yeah.
for me, it starts right beyond, even before that. When I think
Mm,
about my RevOps technology stack, for example,
mm, mm.
I think about it quite brutally in the terms of what's the absolute MVP that I need to operate to
Mhm,
provide the
mhm.
right, discipline to the team, to provide the right experience for our customers, the right predictability, if you like, as a business. What's the absolute MVP I need? And then when you start talking about incremental technologies,
Mm, mm.
what is it really going to bring? Like
Yes.
truly, what's the
Yeah,
value it's going to bring that I
yeah,
don't have to pay on or I can't leverage the technology from? And you talk
yeah,
about that firefighting. You talk about that. I talk about it from an admin perspective, right? I always think about the teams. You go down the list of all of these things. the first question I ask is, what if we don't do that for the next week? What's the impact?
Yeah. Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Is it going to really disrupt something, right? Is it going to all of a sudden, we're a public company, it's going to make our ARR calculation incorrect? We're going to have to fix it, even if it takes us all week, right? But think about it, and I think the only way you can do that is by making sure that every activity is really connected, right? In the sense that this is activity leads to this one and this initiative, and this is the actual business outcome. And for me, that's the way I always operate in terms of let's really be critical about all of this firefighting, because honestly, the fires will always be there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes they just go away by themselves. I think you probably had a lot of scenarios where we didn't look at something and all of a sudden it's not a problem. It's really being critical about what are you actually firefighting, what's the rationale. So I always say to the teams, talk to me about the things that are going to make the biggest impact. Right? There's some stuff we have to absolutely do, and I completely understand. But the others, show me the impact. And if you can't explain that, or your teams can't explain how this actually impacts the subsequent workflow, the subsequent initiative, then we need to go and find that out before spending, exhausting time. Because the fundamental challenge we always have in RevOps is, yes, it's a strategic vision, but 99% of the time we're just doing tactical stuff. And the 1% vision, which makes, as you know, the 80% rule, right? 80% of the impact, we're not spending the right amount of time and capacity on it. So for me, you just have to be quite brutal. And you talk about RevOps, you talk about strategy, you talk about operations and execution. You need people in the team who understand that entire fabric, right? How it connects together. Otherwise, you're effectively saying I've got a siloed organization, but I'm calling it RevOps. But it's really marketing ops doing their thing, sales ops, commercial ops, billing ops. You have to have people sitting in the middle who understand how it all connects, to different parts of the fabric. So then when you have those complex issues and challenges and you say, should we go ahead with it or should we just park it? You need to have that understanding, right? As opposed to saying, let's just stop and see what happens, right? That's not the approach. So for me, RevOps as a principle, as a vision is a great idea, but at the same time, you have to treat it as one workflow.
Makes sense. Those are most of my questions, Faisal. Is there anything I should have asked you that you feel equally excited about that I missed?
Yeah, I mean, we touched on it a little bit. I think the biggest excitement for me at the moment, I think in tech, in SaaS, how that consumer and that business, behavioral, consumption preferences, I think is really changing, right? And I think, obviously you've got people like Bezos who obviously describe customers as always, they're always indiscriminately unhappy with everything, right? For me, that's the way I would always want to build a strategy, right? Based on the fact that this is how consumers want to procure and purchase your products. Is it hybrid pricing? Is it usage-based pricing, fixed pricing? Who knows? User-based pricing may make a comeback, right? But make sure you're agnostic to these things, because the one thing I guarantee you, and I'm a consumer myself, how I wanted to purchase, things 5 or 6 years ago are not the same today, right? And in 5 years' time, it will be the same again. So for me, be quite agnostic around how your consumers are purchasing your products, how you're conveying value. And for me, really have that energy and that focus on saying, if I need to change, I know all the blocks I need to go and move around. And I think for me, if you can understand your fabric and it comes back down to that customer journey, you can change your building blocks, but have those building blocks, really independent of each other. And I think the companies that do that very, very well, I think we see that in a lot of especially some of the incredible SaaS organizations where we see their growth rates, right? They're still posting net retention rates of 140%. It's down. It was 150, 160, but 140% is an incredible number.
Pretty good.
They're still growing 30 to 40%, not 50%. Whereas you've got other companies where you've got this issues and you speak about it, pricing change all of a sudden takes 12 months. Guys, we've just lost 12 months, right? You don't buy that back. So for me, I think consumer changes will come even and more to fruition. I think consumer buying preferences, how they consume, it's going to be a massive, I think innovation coming there. And I think for us, processes, systems, technology, debundle it. I think that's the biggest challenge I would always pose to my teams and recommendations is keep them separate, because you know what? Hey, I want to change it next year.
Exactly.
I don't want this to be a 12-month cycle.
Yes, makes sense. Completely. 100%. Well, Faisal, thank you so much. Really appreciate your thoughts.
Always nice having a chat with you, Ajit. So look forward to the next one.
Thank you.